People will tell you the best revenge is success. They say it with such confidence, like they read it on a poster in a dentist's office. But I've learned something they haven't. The best revenge is letting the people who came to ruin you order their appetizers first, smile at the waiter, settle into the leather booth, and believe with their whole chest that the quiet old man across the table walked in unarmed. Welcome back. Pull your chair in close. Every person you're about to meet in this story had a clean and easy chance to do the decent thing. Nobody held a gun to their head. They sat in their cars in a parking lot, looked at each other, and chose the other road on purpose. If a story about that kind of choice is the sort of thing you stick around for, do me one small kindness and tap subscribe before we go any further. It's free, it takes a second, and it keeps the lights on around here. Now then. The trouble with having money is that nobody will let you have it quietly. The second people find out, they start watching your hands when you reach for your wallet, and you stop being a person and start being a number they're trying to do math on. So I never let them find out. I drive a 2005 Ford F250 with a dent in the tailgate that I put there myself, backing into a fence post in 2011. And I have never once gotten it fixed. Because every time I look at that dent, I remember I was in a hurry that day for no good reason, and the dent reminds me not to be. I wear a Timex. It cost me $31 at a drugstore in Knoxville. It has been on my wrist for 9 years, and it has never been wrong about the time, which is more than I can say for most of the expensive things I've owned. My name is Otis Renner. For 24 years, I have owned Renner Crane Industrial, which is the kind of company that you have absolutely heard of without ever knowing you heard of it. We supply the unglamorous bones of construction, fasteners and fittings and structural steel, the mill supply and the safety gear, the 10,000 boring items that have to show up at a job site at 6 in the morning or nothing gets built that day. We run 11 distribution yards across the Southeast. We employ a little over 3,600 people. Last year we did a number I won't say out loud, because if I said it, you'd treat the rest of the story differently, and I'd rather you didn't. But catch me on a Saturday morning out behind my house near Greenback, Tennessee, in my Carhartt jacket and a feed store cap, walking my bee yard with a smoker in one hand, and you would not offer me a board seat. You would offer me directions. That suits me right down to the ground. My late wife Ruth used to say I dressed like a man who'd lost a bet, and then she'd straighten my collar anyway, because she loved me and because she had standards. She passed 4 years ago this spring. The bees were hers first. I just kept them going. I have one daughter. Her name is Marin, and she did not get my talent for blending into wallpaper. She is sharp and funny, and she has Ruth's whole laugh, the one that starts somewhere down low and surprises everybody, including her. What she also got, God help me, was a weakness for charming men. Big talkers, men who walk into a room like the room sent a car for them. So when she brought Drew Harnett home for Christmas 3 years back, I shook the boy's hand, looked him dead in the eye, and thought two things almost at once. The first was that he was the most polished young man I'd met in a decade. The second was that I had heard the name Harnett somewhere before, a long time ago, in a context I did not enjoy. I'll come back to that second thing. It matters more than anything else in this story. Drew was not a bad young man. I need to be fair to him, because the easy version of this is one where he's a villain, and the easy version would be a lie. He was bright. He was hard-working in the real way, not the way people pretend to be at parties. When Marin told me, a few months in, that she was serious about him, I did what any reasonable father with my particular resources would do. I had him looked into. I'm not embarrassed by that. You can be embarrassed for me if you want. The results came back clean and then some. The boy had a head for operations that you can't teach. He'd turned around a failing regional distributor in Ohio in 18 months before he turned 30. His instincts were good and his numbers were better. So I did something I had never done for any executive in 24 years of running my company. I bent the world a little. I made Drew Harnett the CEO of Renner Crane Industrial, and I made sure he never knew I had anything to do with it. As far as Drew understood, he'd been found by a respected executive search firm, flown out for 3 rounds of interviews, grilled by a board of serious people, and handed the job because he earned it. And here's the thing that still makes me smile. He mostly did earn it. The search firm was real. The board was real. The interviews were brutal and fair. I just made one phone call at the very beginning to point a flashlight at his resume, and then I got out of the way and let him win it himself. Marin knew. Of course Marin knew. She sat at my kitchen table the night I told her, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking at me like I'd grown a second head. "Daddy," she said, "you understand this is a plot line. This is the thing that happens on a show before somebody falls down a flight of stairs." "I prefer to think of it as keeping the company in the family," I told her. "Nobody is in the family yet. He hasn't proposed." "He will," I said. "And when he does, I'd like to already know whether he's the kind of man who runs a business or the kind who burns one down for the insurance." She gave me a look I have been on the receiving end of my entire life. It's the look that says she loves me and that she has serious concerns about my wiring. Ruth had the same one. I think Marin inherited the look along with the laugh. For 14 months, it worked. Better than worked. Drew ran my company with a steadiness that genuinely surprised me, and I do not surprise easy. He cut waste I'd stopped seeing years ago because I'd gotten used to it. He restructured a distribution route through the Carolinas that I'd had 3 previous executives swear couldn't be touched, and he did it without asking permission, which is the only way anything good ever gets done. He'd present a finished solution to the board, and I'd sit in the back of the room in a cardigan that one of my own VPs once tried to give me a coupon for a new one, and I'd watch this young man be excellent, and I'd think, well, maybe she has better taste than I gave her credit for. And I wasn't ready to say that out loud yet, so I just kept it. There was a morning that February I think about more than the rest. One of our oldest customers, a builder out of Chattanooga who'd been with us since before Drew was born, called the main line in a fury because a steel order had shown up short on a job that already had the concrete trucks lined up. That's the kind of thing that costs a client real money by the hour and costs you a relationship you spent 20 years earning. I was in the building that day, in the back, pretending to read a trade magazine. I watched Drew take that call standing up, pacing, and inside of 40 minutes he had a truck rerouted off a lower priority run, the short order made whole, a credit applied that he didn't clear with anybody first, and the Chattanooga man laughing on the phone by the end of it. He never knew the owner of the company was watching him save that account from a folding chair in the corner. He just did it because it was the right thing to do, and it was his to fix. That was the morning I stopped wondering whether I'd made a mistake. He and Marin got married that fall, small ceremony. I wore a suit and felt like a stranger in my own skin. The bees were quiet that day. Everything was good. And then on a Tuesday evening in October, Drew called me, not as the CEO. He called me the way he'd learned to call me, warm and a little careful, the way ambitious young men talk to an older relative they've decided is sweet and simple and a bit behind the times. I let him think that. It's the most useful disguise I own, and it didn't cost me a dime. "Otis," he said, "I want you to come to dinner this weekend. My folks are in town. They've been wanting to meet you properly for ages, and honestly, they've been asking about you a lot lately." There was a small drop in my stomach when he said that. Not alarm. Closer to the feeling you get when you smell something burning in another room, and you can't tell yet whether it's the toast or the house. "They've been asking about me," I said. "Yeah," he said, and then there was a pause that went on about a half second too long. "You know how parents are. They want to know who their boy married into." I almost said no. My gut was not subtle about it. But I have spent 40 years learning that the only thing worse than walking toward a bad feeling is letting it walk toward you while your back's turned. "All right," I said. "Tell me where." The place was called Soline, one of those restaurants in downtown Knoxville where the menu doesn't list prices and the waiter introduces himself by his first name and crouches down beside your table to make eye contact, like he's about to ask you to invest in something. I wore my cleanest flannel and my good boots, the brown ones, the ones I save for funerals and for moments when I want to make a specific point. The point I was making was that I knew exactly what kind of room I was walking into, and I was not going to dress for it. Drew met me at the door. Fresh haircut, a jacket that probably cost more than my truck payment used to be back when I still had one. He looked at my shirt, and I'll give the boy real credit here. He didn't so much as twitch. "You look great," he said. "I look like a man who came to fix the walk-in cooler," I said. He laughed. I didn't. The laugh was real, and the not laughing was a decision. His parents were already seated. Now I want to tell you something I have learned about people because it's about to be useful. When someone has done something they shouldn't have, they almost always greet you too warmly. They overcorrect. The handshake is too firm, the smile arrives a full beat ahead of the eyes. The welcome is so big it's basically an apology in advance for something you don't know about yet. Roland Harnett stood up and shook my hand with both of his. The two-handed grip. In my experience, that grip means one of two things, and the man is either the most sincere person you'll ever meet, or he's already planning the second half of the conversation while he's still in the first. He had silver hair combed back with precision and the kind of even tan that you have to schedule. "Otis," he said, "we have heard so very much about you. Please, sit, sit, sit." Glenda Harnett touched my forearm as I lowered into the chair and said I looked wonderfully relaxed, which is the fine dining way of saying she'd clocked my flannel and decided I was not a threat. She had kind eyes, I noticed. That surprised me, and I filed it away. Roland's eyes were doing arithmetic. Glenda's looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. We ordered. We made the kind of conversation people make when everybody at the table is waiting for something else. Roland asked about my little place out in the country, which Marin had apparently described to them. I told him I kept bees. He nodded the way a man nods when he stopped listening at the word bees. Glenda asked what kind, and seemed to actually want the answer. So I told her Italian honeybees, gentle workers, and for a second, her face softened into something almost wistful. Then Roland said something about the wine and the moment closed up again. Drew talked about the company the way he always did around me, keeping things vague, sanding the details down because he thought he was being polite to the dumb relative. I let him. And then, about 40 minutes in, right in that dead space between the entrees and the part of the night where I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the burning smell, Roland Harnett reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. He brought out an envelope. Heavy paper, the color of fresh cream, the kind of envelope that does not come from a drugstore and was never meant to. He set it down on the white tablecloth in front of me, slowly, deliberately, the way you set down something when you want the other person to understand that the object itself is a sentence, and the sentence is about them. He folded his hands on the table. Glenda picked up her wine and held it without drinking. And Drew, and this is the detail I keep returning to, Drew looked down at his plate like he'd dropped something on it. "Otis," Roland said, and his voice came down a register, the way a man's voice does when the small talk is officially over. "We've been wanting to sit across from you for a long while. There are some things about your history, about the past, that we believe deserve a real conversation between grown men." I looked at the envelope. I looked at Roland. I looked at Drew, who had not raised his eyes off that plate. And I thought, there it is. 24 years of building something quiet. 24 years of believing that the thing I did to a man named Leland Crane was buried so deep that the ground had forgotten the shape of it. And here it was, sitting on a cream envelope between the bread plate and the candle, asking to be opened. I picked up my water glass, took a slow drink, set it down with a small click that I made on purpose. "Roland," I said, "before I open whatever that is, there's something I'd like you to understand about me." He smiled, patient, certain. The smile of a man who's counted the cards and likes his hand. "I'm all ears," he said. I leaned forward just slightly. I have never once in my life sat down at a table I didn't already own the floor under. The envelope sat between us like a hand grenade somebody had already pulled the pin from and set down to see who'd panic first. And not one person at that table, not Roland, not Glenda, not even the boy I'd made into a CEO, knew which one of us had been holding that pin since before the appetizers came out. I did not open the envelope right away. That part matters more than it might sound like it does, so stay with me. This was a performance Roland had built, and a built performance only works if the other person agrees to play their assigned part. He'd chosen the restaurant. He'd timed the reach into his jacket for after the entrees, when people are full and slow and easier to corner. He'd placed the envelope at the precise distance where I'd have to lean to get it. This was choreography, and choreography falls apart the second one dancer just stands still. So I stood still. I picked my fork back up. I cut a piece off my steak. I chewed it, slowly, and I let the quiet come down over the table like a tarp over a woodpile. Glenda shifted in her seat. Roland's patient smile developed a hairline crack at the left corner. Drew still hadn't looked up, but I watched his jaw work. After a stretch of silence, I'd put it right around 40 seconds, which is an extraordinarily long time to do nothing in a restaurant. I set down the fork, wiped my mouth, and reached for the envelope. Inside were documents, photocopies, clean ones, paper-clipped and ordered with the kind of fussy neatness that tells you a lawyer's hands had been on them. I didn't read them line by line. I didn't have to. Because the name at the top of the first page hit me like cold water out of a hose, and my whole chest went still and freezing and perfectly calm in the same instant. Leland Crane. Let me tell you about Leland Crane, and then everything that came after will make sense. In 1989, Leland and I were partners. We were both a hair under 30, broke in the specific way that only young men with too much ambition and no capital can be broke, the kind of broke where you're rich in plans and behind on the electric bill at the same time. We had an idea, a single supply yard outside Cincinnati. Fasteners, fittings, mill supply. The boring guts of the construction trade. We slept on cots in the back office the first winter because we couldn't afford to heat 2 buildings. For 4 years we built it together, and for 4 years I ignored every single sign that Leland Crane was not the man I'd shaken hands with on that cot in the dark. He was skimming, not in some dramatic suitcases of cash way. He did it the way water gets into a foundation, a little at a time, in places you don't check, until one day you lean on a wall you trusted and it gives. By 1992, Leland had quietly funneled enough out of our shared accounts to seed a second operation, a competitor, built on our client list, our supplier relationships, my handshakes, run through a shell company he'd registered under his brother-in-law's name so it wouldn't trace back to him. When I figured it out, I did not get loud. I get very quiet when something matters. I spent the better part of a year, working nights, putting together a record of every diverted contract, every wire, every forged co-signature, and when the file was thick enough to bury him in 11 different directions, I sat across a desk from Leland Crane in the same little Cincinnati office where we'd frozen together that first winter, and I gave him a choice. Dissolve the competing firm, sign over his stake, walk away clean and quiet, or I take the whole file to the prosecutor and he spends the back half of his 30s explaining wire fraud to people who do not care that we used to be friends. Leland chose to walk. I rebuilt the company alone. I kept his name in it, Renner Crane, and people have asked me over the years why I'd do a thing like that. Keep the name of the man who tried to gut me. I'll tell you the truth. I kept it so I'd never get comfortable. Every invoice that crosses my desk has the word Crane on it, and every time I see it, I remember exactly how easy it is to trust the wrong man and exactly what it costs. What I did not know, because there was no way for me to know it, was that Leland Crane had a daughter. She'd have been maybe 9 years old when all of this happened. A little girl who grew up in a house where her father told one version of the story over and over, the version where he was the victim, the version where a cold-blooded man named Renner stole his life's work and left him with nothing. A little girl who believed her daddy, the way little girls do. Her name was Glenda. And Glenda grew up and married a hungry, careful, ambitious man named Roland Harnett, and they had a son, and they named him Drew. I set the documents down. I looked across the table at Glenda Harnett, and I understood all at once why her eyes had looked so tired. She wasn't tired. She was grieving, and she'd been grieving for a very long time. Where did this come from? I asked. I kept my voice flat and level, the way you'd talk to a dog you weren't sure of yet. My father kept records, Glenda said. It was the first full sentence she'd spoken since I sat down, and her voice shook on the last word. Of everything you did to him, every threat, the way you forced him out of a company he poured his whole heart into. Your father, I said. Leland Crane, Roland cut in, smooth, taking the wheel back. Glenda's father. He passed 3 years ago, Otis. Heart gave out. He died in a rented apartment with nothing to his name, because of you. And there it was, the grief, sitting underneath the strategy like a foundation under a house. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it's the most important part. I felt it. I felt a real and quiet ache for the story they were telling, because to Glenda it was not a strategy. To Glenda it was true. She'd watched her father die small and bitter, and somebody had to be the reason, and the reason had a name, and the name was sitting across the table in a flannel shirt eating a steak. "Glenda," I said, and I made sure to use her name and not his. "I am sorry about your father. I am." "I don't want your sorry," she said. But the tears were already standing in her eyes, and that told me she did, a little. She wanted somebody to be sorry. She just wanted it to be the right somebody for the right reason. "What do you want?" I asked. I looked at Roland when I said it, because Glenda wanted the apology, and Roland wanted something with a number attached, and I knew which one of them had built this dinner. Roland leaned in. He'd been waiting for the cue. "We want you to step away," he said, quietly, "from whatever role you still hold in that company, and we want a settlement, paid to my wife as restitution for what was taken from her family, the figures in the envelope, and we want it handled before any of this gets attached to my son's name and his future." And that was when Drew Harnett finally looked up. I need to describe what was on Drew's face when he raised his head, because everything that happens from here turns on it. It was not the face of a man springing a trap. It was the face of a man who'd been told he was attending a dinner and was only now, 3 minutes too late, understanding that he'd been brought along as a prop. There was color climbing up his neck. His eyes went from his father to me and back again, fast, with the particular panic of a person realizing the floor he'd been standing on was somebody else's idea the whole time. "Dad," Drew started. "Drew." Roland said it the way you'd shut a door. Drew's mouth closed. I watched that. I watched the father shut the son up with a single word, and I filed it next to everything else. "How long have you known about this?" I asked Drew directly. He looked at his father, then back at me. "I knew there was old history between our families," he said, and his voice had lost the boardroom in it. "Dad told me when Marin and I got serious. He said there'd been bad blood, years back, between the Cranes and the man who built Renner. He said it might be." Drew stopped. He'd hit a word he didn't want to say. "Might be what?" I said. "An opportunity," Drew said, very quietly, like the word tasted bad coming out. He didn't say anything after that, and the silence said the rest. Glenda reached over and laid her hand on top of mine on the tablecloth. Her skin was warm, and her wedding ring was cold, and the warmth of the gesture was so practiced that I almost looked around for the script she'd rehearsed it from. "Otis," she said, "this doesn't have to be ugly. We're family now. This is just about making something right that's been wrong for 30 years. I looked at her hand on mine. I looked at her face, at the real grief in it sitting next to the rehearsed gentleness, and I felt sorry for her. I did, because I think a part of Glenda Crane had been waiting her whole life for someone to make it right, and I was about to be the one to tell her that the wrong she'd been carrying was never the wrong she thought. "Glenda," I said, and I covered her hand with my free one gently. "I want you to hear this next part as clear as you've ever heard anything in your life. Because here's what they didn't understand about a man who has been doing this for 40 years. You do not walk into a room like this empty-handed. You especially do not walk in empty-handed when your own gut spent the better part of a week whispering at you, and a name like Leland Crane is still floating somewhere in the deep water of your past. I'd made some calls of my own that week, before I ever got in the truck. I reached into the inside pocket of my flannel and I took out my own envelope. Smaller than Roland's, white, cheap, the kind you'd use to mail a birthday card to a grandchild. I set it down on the tablecloth next to his. "Leland's records," I said, "are incomplete," which makes perfect sense. A man building a story where he's the victim only keeps the pages that flatter him. He throws the rest in the fire. Roland's eyes dropped to my little white envelope, and the patient certainty went out of his face 1 degree at a time. "What's in here," I said, tapping it once, "are the originals. Bank records from the joint account Leland and I held between 1990 and 1992. The withdrawal pattern, wire transfers, dated and signed into a shell company registered under the name of Leland's brother-in-law, a man named Carl Dietz, who I am told is still alive and would very much not like to discuss it. Correspondence, including 2 letters in Leland's own hand, laying out his plan to copy our client list and stand up a competing yard using suppliers we had under exclusive contract. I let that sit a second. I also have a sworn, notarized statement from a man named Walt Sorensen. Walt kept our books in those years. He's 73 now, lives outside Dayton, healthy as a horse, and is entirely willing to put his hand on a Bible and describe exactly what your father instructed him to move, and where, and when. I spoke to Walt on Wednesday. He remembered all of it. Men like Walt always do. The honest ones never forget the day they were asked to do something dishonest. Glenda had gone very still. The hand under mine had stopped being warm. "That's not true," she said, but it came out small. "That's not. My father told me." "I know he did," I said, and I meant it kindly, which was the cruelest part. "I know exactly what your father told you, Glenda, because I have spent 30 years imagining what a man like that would say to a little girl to keep himself from having to look in the mirror. He told you he built something and a wolf came and took it. The trouble is, your father was the wolf. He just got to the story first, and he told it to a child who had no way to check it, and then he died, still telling it. I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry, but I am not going to sit at this table and let you point a thing at me that I have spent my whole life knowing the truth of." Roland's jaw was working now, but no words were coming out of it. He'd brought what he believed was a loaded weapon to this dinner, and he'd just watched me show him it was a photograph of a weapon. If you've stuck with me to this point, do me that second favor I mentioned. Hit the like button and subscribe. Most folks who watch all the way through never tap a thing, and that's all right. But if you've got it in you, it's the whole reason I get to keep telling these. All right, back to the table. Roland tried a different door. When the strategy fails, men like Roland always reach for the principal. It's the last thing in the bag. "Whatever the paperwork says," he said, and his voice had gone hard and a little high. "The fact remains that you ended a man. You ruined Glenda's father. You can dress it up in affidavits all you like, Otis. But Leland Crane died with nothing, and you are sitting here worth God knows what. That is a moral fact, and no notary is going to change it." I looked at him for a long moment. "You're right that he died with nothing," I said. "You're wrong about why. He died with nothing because after I gave him a clean way out, a way that kept him out of a courtroom and out of the papers, he turned around and did the exact same thing to 2 more partners over the next 15 years. I know because both of them found me, eventually. People who've been robbed the same way tend to find each other. Leland Crane didn't die poor because of me, Roland. He died poor because he was the kind of man who couldn't stop, and the 3rd and 4th and 5th time, there was no old friend left to give him a soft landing." Glenda made a sound then. Not a sob exactly. More like the air going out of a thing that had been holding its shape on pressure alone. I think some part of her had always known. I think a daughter always knows, somewhere down under the love, whether her father was a robbed man or a robbing one. The knowing just doesn't have anywhere to go until somebody says it out loud at a dinner table. "Sit back, Roland," I said, because he'd started to half rise out of his chair, the way a man does when his legs make a decision before his brain catches up. "We're not finished. And the part we're not finished with isn't about you, or about Leland, or about a thing that happened before your son could walk. It's about him." I turned to Drew. And here, finally, I saw something on Drew Harnett's face that I'd been waiting all night to see and hadn't been sure I would. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the rehearsed concern his mother wore or the cold calculation his father had walked in with. It was shame. Plain and unmistakable shame. The kind you can't fake because faking it requires the one thing the person doesn't have, which is the willingness to be seen failing. "Drew," I said, "I'm going to tell you some things now, and I need you to hear them not as my son-in-law, and not as the CEO of a company, and not as a man trying to manage a difficult dinner. I need you to hear them as Drew, just the man. Can you do that?" He nodded. Barely, but he nodded. "What do you actually know," I said, "about how you got your job?" He straightened up half an inch out of pure reflex. The CEO posture, the automatic gathering of composure I'd watched him deploy in a dozen board meetings. "I was recruited," he said, "by an executive search firm. I interviewed with the board 3 times. It was a serious process." "It was," I said. "Every bit of it was real. Your numbers were strong and your instincts were better, and I want you to keep hold of that, because it's true and you're going to need it in about a minute." "What do you mean, keep hold of it?" he said. "I mean, I said, slow, that the search firm that came looking for you was hired by me. The board that grilled you reports to me. The corner office on the 11th floor, the car allowance, the salary I happen to know down to the dollar because I'm the one who approved it. All of it sits inside a company that I own, outright. Have owned for 24 years. There is no other owner, Drew. There never has been. It's me. It's been me the whole time. Drew's face did a thing I have only seen a few times in my life. It just stopped, like a man who'd been handed a number that wouldn't add up no matter how he turned it, and his whole system simply quit trying. You, he said. Otis Renner, I said. The Renner and Renner Crane. You've been running my company for 14 months, son. Reporting to my executives, signing my contracts, sitting in a chair I put you in. Nobody said anything. The candle on the table did its small work. Somewhere behind me, a different table laughed at a different joke in a different world. Why? Drew said. It came out younger than anything else he'd said all night, stripped right down to the bone. Why would you do that? Because I'm her father, I said. And before I let her marry a man, I wanted to know what kind of man he was when he didn't think the boss was watching. So I made you the boss, and then I watched. That's all it ever was. I gave him a second. What I just put on him was a heavy thing, and I'm not in the business of crushing people for sport. Decisions a man makes while he's falling are rarely the ones he stands behind later, and I wanted Drew on his feet before the next part, because the next part was the part where he had to choose something. He ran both hands back through his hair, breathed out through his nose, looked at the white tablecloth for a long moment, like there might be an answer woven into it, and then he turned to his father. I watched something change in Drew's eyes that I had genuinely not seen coming, and I am a man who plans for nearly everything. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't even shame. It was something colder than both, and clearer. How long? Drew said to Roland, quiet, even. Roland said nothing. Dad, how long have you known who Otis was? Roland reached up and adjusted one cufflink. A small, useless gesture, the kind a man makes when he needs his hands to be busy so his face doesn't have to do the work. I had a suspicion when you told me the company name, he said finally. Renner Crane. Your grandfather's name was in it. Glenda's father. I did some looking. When I told you the company name, Drew repeated, that was before Marin and I were engaged. That was the first month I had the job. I was protecting this family, Roland said. You positioned me. Drew's voice came out flat and exact, like he was reading the words off a document he wished he'd never been handed. You found out who I was really working for, and you saw an angle. You let me fall in love with Marin, you encouraged it. Every time I called home, you asked about her family, about the company, about Otis. I thought you were being a father. You were doing reconnaissance. Drew, Glenda started. Your grandfather deserved. Don't. Drew didn't raise his voice. He just put the word down hard. Don't bring Grandpa Leland into this right now, Mom. Please. Not while I'm trying to figure out whether anything in my own life is what I thought it was. I stayed completely still. What was happening across that table had stopped having anything to do with me. It was a young man seeing his own father in clear light, maybe for the first time, and the only correct thing to do in that moment, the only decent thing, was to take my hands off the wheel and let him steer. Roland reached for the principal one more time. It was all he had left. Everything I have ever done, he said, I did for you, for your future. That man across the table took everything from your grandfather. You were finally in a position to what? Drew's voice cracked clean down the middle on the word, and then hardened right back over, the way a young man's will when he refuses to let the feeling finish the sentence for him. To help you shake down my wife's father at a dinner table, to use Marin, to use my marriage as a crowbar to pry open a grudge from before I was born, over a story that, from the look of what's sitting on this tablecloth, was never even true. Roland had no answer for that. He opened his mouth and shut it, and for the first time all night, the practiced confidence drained all the way out of his face and left something underneath it that just looked old and caught. Drew turned back to me, and when he did, His face had reassembled into something I recognized, because I'd watched him wear it in difficult board meetings when a deal was going sideways and somebody had to be the steady one. It was, I realized with a quiet pride I kept entirely to myself, the face of a CEO. "I owe you an apology," Drew said. "You don't," I said. "I do. I sat at this table and watched my father slide an envelope across it at you, and I looked at my plate. I knew something was wrong about tonight before we walked in. My mother was too nervous and my father was too calm, and I came anyway, and I sat down and I went quiet. That's not the man I want to be." I looked at him a long time. "No," I said, "it isn't. And the fact that you know that right now, with your father sitting there, is the only reason you still have a job on Monday morning." Something crossed his face. Relief, trying very hard to keep its dignity. I turned back to Roland, and I felt the temperature in my own voice drop, because the kindness I'd been spending on Glenda was not available for him. "Those documents you brought tonight," I said, nodding at the cream envelope still sitting where he'd placed it, untouched now, looking smaller than it had an hour ago. "They're incomplete, they're slanted, and set next to what I've put on this table. They're worth less than the paper. I want you to understand that. You came in here tonight believing you were holding a knife. You were holding a drawing of a knife. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole evening." Roland's jaw kept moving. Nothing came out. "I'm not going to pursue you," I said. "Not because I couldn't. I want you to be very clear that I could. I have a sworn statement and 3 decades of records and the patience of a man who has buried a wife and built a company and is not afraid of a courtroom. I'm letting it go because of her." I nodded at Glenda. "Because she lost her father twice, once when he died and once tonight, and a person can only carry so much in one evening. That's the only reason. It's got nothing to do with mercy for you." Glenda was crying quietly now, looking at the tablecloth, her wine untouched. I'll tell you the truth. I almost felt the pull to comfort her. Almost. But comfort from me was the one thing she could never accept, because accepting it would mean admitting the whole shape of her grief had been wrong, and that's not a thing you can ask a person to do over dessert. "But here's the part I'll only say one time," I said, and I leaned in so that all 3 of them were inside the small circle of it. "Drew is the CEO of my company. Maren is my daughter, and as of a trust that vested on her 30th birthday 18 months ago, she is also the majority shareholder of that company. She has sat on the board for a year and a half under her late mother's maiden name, Ruth's name, which is why none of you ever connected her to a thing. Your son didn't marry into a grudge, Roland. He married into something real, something built clean over 40 years by a man you came here tonight to rob. And the only reason any of that is still standing open to him, and through him to you, is that he just proved to me in the last 10 minutes that he is not his father." The quiet that came down after that sentence was the most expensive silence I have ever owned, and I didn't spend $1 buying it. Roland Harnett picked up his napkin, folded it once, twice, with the careful precision of a man whose hands need a job because his pride no longer has one. He set it beside his plate. "We should go," he said to Glenda. Quiet now, all the volume gone out of him. She nodded. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her son. They stood. Roland's hand twitched toward the cream envelope out of pure reflex, and then he stopped and left it where it lay. That was the smartest thing he did all night. He paused at his son's shoulder on his way past. "I'll call you," Roland said. Drew looked straight ahead at the candle, not at his father. "Don't," he said. "Not for a while. I'll call you. When I'm ready, and I don't know when that is." The distance in those few words could have filled the whole restaurant. Glenda stopped beside Drew's chair, and for a second I thought she'd say something, and her mouth even opened, but whatever it was didn't come. She put her hand on her son's shoulder, just for a moment, and then she followed her husband out, and the door of Celine closed behind the 2 of them with the soft, padded, expensive sound that doors in places like that make, a sound designed so that nothing ever slams. Some bridges you burn on purpose. Some a man burns himself just by walking across them the wrong way, one too many times. The Harnetts walked out of that restaurant and out of any room I will ever be in again, and I watched them go, and I felt nothing dramatic at all. Just the small, settled click of a thing that had been left unfinished for 30 years, finally being set down on a shelf where it belonged. Drew and I sat there a minute, the two of us, the cream envelope between us like something somebody forgot. The waiter materialized at the edge of the table with the careful optimism of a man who'd been watching from a safe distance and judged the storm to have passed. "Can I tempt either of you with dessert?" he asked. Drew looked at me. I looked at Drew. "You know what?" I said. "Yes. What's the chocolate one?" "The flourless torte, sir, with the—" "2 of those," I said. "And coffee. The real kind. None of the decaf business." The waiter vanished, visibly relieved to have a task that wasn't bearing witness. Drew let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting in his chest since the appetizers. "Otis," he said. "Yeah." "Can I ask you something, and will you tell me the truth?" "Always," I said. He looked at me dead on, the way he had not been able to do for most of the night. "Do you actually trust me to run the company? Not as Marin's husband. Not because tonight went the way it did. As a CEO, do you trust me?" I gave the question the weight it had earned, because a man who asks it that plainly deserves a real answer and not a kind one. 6 months ago, I said, you took the Carolina distribution mess that 3 executives swore couldn't be touched, and you fixed it. Saved us a number with a comma in it I won't say at the table. Nobody asked you to. You found the problem, built the answer, and brought it to the board finished. I sat in the back in a cardigan you've offered to replace twice and watched you do it. I paused. So yes, I trust you. I trusted you before tonight. Tonight just told me something different, which is that I can stand next to you when it's bad, not just when it's good. He nodded, slow, taking it in. "But," I said, and he looked up, "Monday morning, you and I are going to have a real conversation. Not father-in-law and son-in-law, not owner and CEO. 2 men at my kitchen table with the bad coffee, and we're going to lay everything flat. No more vague answers when you talk to me about the company. No more treating me like the simple old relative. You know who I am now. We start over from the truth." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're really not going to start dressing differently, are you?" he said. "The flannel stays," I said. "The flannel built her inheritance. The flannel is not up for discussion." He laughed. A real one. The first fully real thing I'd gotten out of him all night. The torte came. We ate it. The chocolate was outrageous, the kind of good that almost makes you forgive a place for not printing its prices. I made a mental note to leave the waiter something generous, because the man had walked into that crossfire 4 separate times with a smile, and that is a kind of courage they don't put on the menu. I drove home in my 2005 F250 with the dent in the tailgate, down out of the lights of Knoxville and into the dark that gets darker the closer you get to my place. I let the windows down even though it was cool, because I think better with the air moving. I thought about Leland Crane, not the man who tried to gut me, the other one, the young one, the one who'd frozen next to me on a cot in a back office in 1989 because neither of us could afford to heat 2 buildings. I wondered, the way I have wondered 100 times, exactly when it turned in him. Whether there was a day, a single Tuesday like any other, when he decided the easy theft was worth more than the hard friendship, or whether it crept in so slow that even he couldn't have pointed to the morning it started. I thought about Glenda, somewhere out there tonight, having to rebuild her own father from the studs up. That's a hard renovation. Some people never finish it. Some people just move out and leave the house standing wrong. And I thought about Drew, driving home to my daughter right then, trying to work out how on earth you explain to your wife that the dinner with your parents had quietly demolished and rebuilt your entire understanding of your own life in the space of 90 minutes. And I thought about Ruth, the way I do on most drives home in the dark. She'd have hated every part of that dinner and loved exactly one part of it, the part where the boy chose right with his father sitting 2 feet away. Ruth always believed people were mostly the choices they made when it cost them something. She used to say you could dress a man in anything you wanted, but you found out who he was. The first time being honest was going to hurt him. She'd have liked Drew tonight. She'd have told me so in the truck, and then she'd have told me to throw out the flannel, and I'd have kept both her opinion and the flannel, which is roughly how the whole marriage went. I thought about what it actually means to build a thing. And I don't only mean a company. I mean a way of standing in the world such that when someone finally comes for you, and somebody always eventually comes for you, you are not caught flat-footed with a fork in your hand. You've already done the quiet work. You made the calls on Wednesday. You're already, in every way that counts, home. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck a minute with the engine ticking and looked at my house. Modest. Warm. The kitchen light on, because Maren had stopped by earlier in the week, and she has never once in her life remembered to turn off a kitchen light, same as her mother, and I have never once minded. My phone buzzed in my jacket. A text from Drew. Told Maren everything. She says you're impossible and she loves you. She also says the flannel is humiliating and that she's officially on my side about it. I sat there in the dark and smiled at the little screen like a fool. Tell her, I wrote back, the flannel is the reason she owns more of that company than anybody alive. Good night, son. I put the phone away, got out of the truck. The night was cool and clean and smelled like the cut grass and the start of wood smoke from somebody's chimney down the road. Out behind the house, in the dark, my hive sat quiet, the bees clustered tight against the cool, doing the patient, invisible work that nobody sees and everybody depends on. Ruth's bees, still going. Somewhere across the dark, Roland Harnett was sitting with an empty cream envelope and a story that had just lost its load-bearing wall. And Glenda was sitting beside him, carrying a grief that no longer pointed where she'd always aimed it, which is its own kind of heavy. And I was home, walking up to my own front door with the bad chocolate still on my tongue and nothing on my conscience. Some men build empires to prove they matter. I built mine so that the people I love would never have to sit at a table across from someone who came to take and wonder if anyone was coming to stand beside them. That was always the whole point. The money was just the part that kept score. I let myself in, turned off the kitchen light, went to bed. If this one landed for you, do the thing that keeps these stories alive. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Tell me in the comments whether Drew earned that second chance or whether you'd have let him go right along with his father, because I genuinely want to know how you'd have called it. And as always, thank you for pulling up a chair. I'll see you at the next one.